Welcome to the Human Frame podcast.
With me, Łucja Hawking. Today I am joined by Sheila Hayman. Sheila is a BAFTA and BAFTA Fulbright-winning documentary filmmaker whose work explores the intersections of culture, technology and music. A Director's Fellow at MIT Media Lab and currently at Cambridge University's Minderoo Centre, her films have anticipated the rise of surveillance, smartphones and deepfakes and reached a global audience. Her acclaimed works include The Electronic Frontier and Mendelssohn and the Nazis and Me, along with projects with the London Symphony Orchestra and the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. She has also been a Guardian columnist, prize-winning journalist and novelist, and a musician with Gaelic Storm in Titanic. Beyond her creative career, Sheila runs a therapeutic writing group at Freedom from Torture, supporting survivors through storytelling. So I'll just start into it. Thanks again, Sheila, for doing this podcast with me.
You're very welcome.
I mean, I've got so many different questions about all the different aspects of your life and your both creative and more human rightsy type work. So you've been creating award-winning documentaries since the 1980s. What first drew you to becoming a filmmaker and telling stories in that way?
I made the mistake of studying Chinese for 2 years at university. Unfortunately, I was able to change my mind after that and do something else. But after that 2 years, my German grandmother thought it would be a good idea for me to go and practice my Chinese. So I was sent off to Hong Kong for one summer, where I lived with a very rather unsociable family. And so in order to make my time more interesting, I decided to do some Chinese cookery courses. And on my way to one of these Chinese cookery classes, I used to pass an old woman selling oranges on a corner. And after a while, as you do, I stopped noticing her. And then one day I was watching television and there was a film about a sort of Buddhist care home where people would go and spend the last years of their life, and in return for all their worldly goods, they would be looked after until they died. And it was an interesting portrait of this place, but one of the people in it, one of the residents, was this woman I'd seen selling oranges. And from seeing this film, I got a completely different picture of her. She was filled out in dimensions in a way that she hadn't been before. And it occurred to me quite suddenly that this was an extraordinary thing that you could do, that you could make films that would literally add dimensions to things that people wouldn't notice or would think that they knew about or would ignore, and that you could bring them alive through documentary films. So that was really what they call my inciting incident.
That's really interesting to hear about the Buddhist perspective as well. I studied Buddhism for quite a long time at uni, so that's
Right.
a really interesting, fascinating part of it. Many of your films explore a lot of historical perspectives and identities and voices that might otherwise be lost. So how do you choose the stories you want to tell?
I think that's not really true of most of my films. I mean, I made a film about my great-great-great-grandmother, Fanny Mendelssohn, who, it's true, wasn't very well known. But over the years, as you said in your introduction, most of my films have been about the relationship between people and technology. And that, I have no really good way of explaining that fascination, but I know where it started. I was at university and I was walking up the road one day towards my college. And I suddenly thought, why is it that when we think about the future, everybody has the same picture in their head and it's fully automated and there's a sort of dome over it and everybody's wearing these kind of zip-up jumpsuits and all the cars are driving themselves. And I thought it's really peculiar that we have this shared image of the future, and I wonder where it started. So I sort of went back to look at the history of the image of the future, and that eventually became the first of two films called A Short History of the Future that I made for Channel 4 when I left the BBC. And even before that, I'd actually made a film in the BBC Science Department about robots and biscuits, as it turned out, because one day when I was a young director in the BBC, my head of department called me into his office and he said, Sheila, they've made a robot that can bring you a cup of coffee. Go and make a film about how robots are going to take over the world. Well, this is 40 years ago now. And so I went to look at this coffee-carrying robot and I watched as it stuttered and crashed and stumbled and got caught up in things and spilled the coffee, and the engineers were sweating and trying again and getting more and more upset and more anxious about it. And I noticed that while all this was going on, there were humans who were walking along, carrying cups of coffee, conducting conversations at the same time, negotiating wires on the floor, all with no apparent difficulty at all. And I ended up thinking, robots are really stupid and people are really amazing. So pursuing this thing about what it would take to make a robot that was anything like as clever as a human, we thought, what would it take to get a robot to bring you a biscuit with your coffee? So I went to McVitie's and I got them to give us a case of chocolate digestive biscuits. And we went round the world looking at all the things that would be necessary for a robot to bring you a biscuit with your cup of coffee, which included vision systems and 3-axis stabilized arms and haptic feedback, all sorts of things. I mean, like, for instance, a biscuit. You would struggle to define a biscuit visually. I mean, it could be round or it could be square, and it could be pink or it could be brown, and it could be shiny or it could be matte, and it might be yellow with a daub of jam in the middle of it, or it might be chocolate and oblong. But give any toddler a biscuit and they will not only know what it is, but they will know what to do with it immediately. And that was really the beginning of my understanding of my current preoccupation, which is embodied intelligence. The fact that our intelligence is completely different from so-called AI, which only knows 1 and 0, because it comes from millions of years of evolution in the world, interacting physically with other physical objects and gaining concepts of them and understanding them in an embodied way, which a computer that doesn't have a body and doesn't have a self can never do. So that's really how it started anyway.
You got me hungry thinking about biscuits now. But I'm also I'm also curious about what your thoughts about, obviously, AI within, the film industry is really expanding, and obviously that people are very torn between it. I'm just curious about what your thoughts about that are.
My main thoughts about so-called AI, I won't call it AI, it's not intelligent, it's machine learning, it's pattern recognition. It's very good at find, compare and remember and now generate, and that's literally all it does. My main thought about it is it's completely unaffordable if we're going to have a planet that we can live on. I mean, so, okay, very, very simple example. We've talked about children and biscuits and, computers, self-driving cars. Okay, everybody thinks, oh, it would be wonderful to have self-driving cars, then we wouldn't have so many accidents. Actually, statistically not true. But getting beyond that, the computer that is necessary to drive a self-driving car, not the computer that all cars have that regulates their other systems, but just the driving bit, uses literally 1,000 times as much energy as a human. Why? Because it doesn't have any concepts. When a human driver is driving down the road, for instance, it knows what it needs to pay attention to and what it can safely ignore. So, we know that the traffic light isn't going anywhere, but we know that we should maybe watch out for the little child chasing a ball or the old woman who's just got off a bus and is crossing the road. We ignore everything else because we understand how things behave and how they will interact. If we see a brown object in front of us, it might be a brown paper bag or a brown rock or a brown chocolate cake or a brown cat. Now, we will have very different experiences if we drive over those 4 things, and we understand that. So we might drive over the paper bag, avoid the rock, hope that the cat will get out of the way, and generally think, well, I don't want chocolate cake all over my tyres. But a computer has no concepts. It doesn't have an understanding of anything. All it can know is, have I seen something that looks a bit like this before? And it will stop. So it takes massive and massive amounts of computation to do that kind of thing. And the same applies for anything at all. The same applies for generating images, generating answers to questions. In order to sort of seem like a human and answering your question, it has to make enormous efforts because it's not a human. It's just a machine that literally only knows 1 and 0 and can only recognize patterns in 1 and 0. So beyond all the questions about copyright and beyond all the questions about fake creativity and the fact that all that it can ever do is regurgitate things that have been done before, the thing that really preoccupies me the most is the energy, because I'm a big environmentalist and I do not want to live on a dead planet, well, to die on a planet that's inhabited by robots and nothing else.
I've never seen it from that perspective. I think everyone, as you said, is always very much looking at the copyright issues and voice actors and actors and even, within documentaries as well. But I think, like you said, the energy, that might be another way of looking at it and seeing it more as a mechanical thing rather than, taking over creativity.
It can't take over creativity. It can take over good enough. I think that's the thing. I think that people who are genuinely hugely creative, the great musicians and composers, for instance, or great writers or really creative artists, their creativity is needed and will always be needed. But there are also people who make stuff that's kind of good enough. There are the musicians who write music that gets played in hotel lobbies and lifts. what I call orphan art. Nobody loves it when it's created, nobody loves it when it's put out there, nobody loves it when it's commissioned, and nobody loves listening to it. But nevertheless, it has a function in the world. And at the moment, that function is fulfilled by humans who get some creative satisfaction from it and get paid for it. And the trouble is that good enough is very easy for these bots to do. And they can make enormous quantities of it very cheaply, as long as you discount the fact that they've been trained on other people's work. And so I think that the danger really from that perspective is not only that the good enough work will be taken away, but that we will all be dumbed down into thinking that good enough is good enough, into not wanting or caring about something being exceptionally good or really interesting or very funny, because we'll have been sort of gradually deadened into a state of acceptance of mediocrity in all our creative endeavors. And I think that's a real possibility. And that's really what worries me. Obviously, I'm very worried for the livelihoods of those people, but I'm worried for the general standard of our culture, being kind of stupefied.
I completely agree with you on that. You kind of touched on this, but what role do you think creativity plays in making complex human experiences accessible to a wider audience?
So when I first joined the BBC, I was in the science department. And so my job quite often involved going to talk to scientists about their work and reducing it to language that an ordinary person could understand. And usually my stratagem was to say to them, don't imagine that I know everything. Pretend I'm a rather attractive but completely ignorant person that you've just met in a bar and that you're trying to chat me up. And now tell me about your work. This is the kind of thing that you would not say now, but in those days it was considered acceptable. I very rapidly discovered that if I couldn't summarize the life's work of a Nobel Prize-winning scientist in 10 minutes, they would get very cross. But that if I could, they would get even crosser. But that was the job. And so I learned to be quite good at summarizing complicated things in simple ways. But I think also, simple familiar examples, for instance, the child and the biscuit that I was talking about just now, or, getting a computer to recognize a cat. You have to show it 60,000 pictures of cats in trees, cats rolled up in carpets, cats in boxes. And even then, if it encounters a cat, fighting another cat or with a hat on, it won't recognize it as a cat. But you give a cat to a toddler, or two or three encounters with a cat, and it would recognize any cat as a cat for the rest of its life. And so you can give people very simple examples of things with which they are very familiar and explain an awful lot of what might otherwise seem very complicated in that way. I think working with refugees and migrants, which, as you've said, I also do, it's a more complicated challenge, because there you've got the problem that almost always you're preaching to the choir. You're making films or whatever it is, and the only people who are interested, the only people who will watch your films are people who already think that migration is fine and refugees are people like us, and what's the problem? And so if you're trying to reach the disaffected, if you're trying to, as it were, go into the enemy camp, or at least the undecided camp, you have to be quite clever. And so what we do at the charity, what I try to do with the group, is to, as it were, use art as a stealth weapon. So the rocket fuel is the experiences these people have had, the torture, the migration, the horror, the whatever it is, the losing their families, they're leaving everything behind that they loved. That is a powerful emotional experience, and that is the rocket fuel for the strength and power of their creativity. But you sheath it in a beautiful poem or a wonderful visual or a musical work. And you say to people, you don't say, here's this heart-wrenching story about this unfortunate migrant. You say, listen to this poem. Look at this beautiful film. Have you ever heard this piece of music before? And before they know it, they're seduced by the beauty of it into receiving the message that otherwise they would ignore or not want to know. And it's difficult. And that's why I've never actually made a film. One of the reasons I've never made a film with the group is because, or a big film with the group, is because I've seen so many documentaries absolutely with the best intentions in the world made about refugees and migrants and migrations and all those kinds of things. And they're only ever seen by people who essentially are on the side of the angels already. And it's a very, very difficult challenge, but we go on trying.
Yeah, that's so well put. I think, like you said, it's like preaching to the choir and not expecting, we're never going to convince people that have got a very hard opinion on not accepting refugees or anything like that. Yeah. But I don't know, I'm in the camp that maybe, hopefully, film and documentaries might have the possibility of changing perspective if it is individual stories that people illustrate.
I think I think it's certainly true that actually meeting people face to face as a human being, as a sister or a brother or a teacher or a nurse or a fan of Only Fools and Horses, as one of our group is. I mean, as you meet them as an individual human being, absolutely, I agree that does make a difference to people's response. But it's getting them there in the first place that's tricky, Yeah.
I think it's hitting them in situations where they might not have come across those kind of stories before.
Yeah.
But again, picking moments where that is when you do it is very interesting. I think for me, it's even like going to festivals, short films that do very, very either indirectly or directly talk about migration or refugee experiences might be another way to, again, really humanize. Because I think, refugees don't always look like refugees. What you would think a typical refugee might look like, or what you think, or the experience that they have might be very different from what the media, and I mean all of this
Well, I mean, we could all be refugees. My father was a refugee. He ended up being the second youngest fellow of the Royal Society in this century, and having honours piled on him. And he was a mathematician, and he wouldn't have thought of himself as a refugee apart from he had this incredibly thick German accent. But I mean, you don't think of refugees, or most people I think don't think of refugees as being highly educated people, or people who come from sort of very privileged backgrounds, or people who've got all these different skills, or they just think of some sort of draggled person staring miserably out at the rain on an Essex seafront, talking about how hard their life has been. I mean, humour is also very interesting as well, because comedy, as we know, is just tragedy from the other point of view, and so even in the blackest situation, somehow there's a reflex that kind of enables you to see the other side. And so some of people in the group are very good at turning their terrible or difficult moments into some kind of dark comedy, and I think that's a fantastic gift as well.
Definitely. And what made you want to start the group, or get involved in?
I didn't start the group, and it was completely accidental, actually. When my children were very small, I'd stopped making films for a bit and become a writer. As you said, I'd written a couple of novels and some screenplays, and I discovered very quickly that I enjoyed writing very much, and I still do, but the writer's lifestyle was a complete nightmare. And I think to enjoy the writer's lifestyle, you really have to enjoy the inside of your own head and the smell of your own trainers more than the outside world. And I've always been somebody who wanted adventures and wanted to be out there meeting people and talking to people. And so I sort of started to get cabin fever and thought I'd better start doing some volunteering. And I went pretty much round the corner to the nearest charity I could find, which at that point was called the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture. And I said, "Do you need any volunteers?" And they said, "Maybe, what can you do?" And I said, "Not much, but I can write a bit." And they said, "We've just started this writing group. Would you like to come and volunteer with it?" So I started as a volunteer, and then a couple of years later, I became the coordinator and started working full time. And I've been there for 20-something years ever since, which is terrifying. But somehow every time I think I really ought to stop, it's so interesting that I can't.
As you said, you probably get so many different stories, and like you said, the creativity that comes out of. I can't really put it in any other words than trauma, really. Is fascinating.
No, absolutely.
It is also such a healing process. I mean, for me anyway, as because I'm an actor myself, so it is very healing in portraying of a situation. I don't know if that's what you've also experienced from that.
The very particular thing about torture, one very particular thing about torture, is that one of its major intentions is to silence you and to make you feel that you don't exist. And if you did exist, you would be no more valuable than an old piece of chewing gum stuck to the carpet. And to take away your voice and indeed your impulse to speak. And so by writing with survivors, we're actually rebuilding their identity by giving them a voice in a new language. We're giving them a new identity with which they can speak, and having discovered that voice, they realize that they do exist after all. And when they start using that voice to perform to audiences, and the audience's attention reflects back at them like a mirror, then that's another level of affirmation. And so it's a very, very powerful experience for a lot of these people, even though it's incredibly difficult as well, because often they're writing in their fourth or fifth language. They persevere because because they discover that this is a way that they can rebuild their identity and rediscover who they are.
What are some of the most powerful moments you've witnessed or experienced while working with survivors through art and writing?
Well, I can give you two or three examples. So one of them is that we have a person in the group who was a very successful science teacher back in his home country. Quite young, he was often teaching people older than himself because you stay at school until you pass your exams. And he would have 50 or 60 people in the class, and yet he was so passionate about it that he was able to keep their attention. And when exam time came near, he would invite them to his home to study because he had electricity and they didn't. I mean, he was really dedicated. But he'd never done any creative writing in his life. And so he joined the group with very little English because he was a Francophone African. And the first thing I asked him to write, I said, write about your perfect day. And sure enough, his perfect day consisted of marking yesterday's lessons and setting tomorrow's homework. But then one day in the group, we read a poem. I think it was Kipling's If, something with a very simple scheme, that you can easily pick up. And something happened, and he wrote a poem in that form. And then he wrote another one. And it was like seeing him grow a new limb. It was the most extraordinary thing. He was saying, in effect, is this me? Did I do that? Did this come out of me? His sort of joy and delight was absolutely wonderful to witness. It was such a privilege. It was like midwifing some new baby into the world. Mm-hmm. So that was a really amazing moment. There was another amazing moment when we did a musical performance at the Roundhouse called Lost and Found. And at the end of it, because we were singing and in the performance, and at the end of it there was a sort of invitation to come on stage and dance, and everybody came onto the stage, and so there were sort of hundreds of people mixing up with our performers and just dancing away to this wonderful African music on stage. So that was very good. But then in a completely different mood, we were working in the workshop one day. We have a group workshop every 2 weeks, and I'd given them as an exercise to think about a really important conversation, a conversation that was, and how they prepared for it. And it was called Finding the Words. And so it was, how do you find the words for these important conversations? And the first few examples were quite funny. There was a man trying to have a conversation with his cat about not scratching the sofa. There was somebody who was trying to have a conversation about having lost her suitcase, or where might it be. But then two people, completely unexpectedly to me, read out stories where they had to tell one of their relatives that their child had died. And they both wanted to read, and they both broke down. It was these are real conversations that they'd had, and they were still really painful. And I thought, oh my God, this is awful. I'm re-traumatizing everybody in the group. What have I done? Why did I not think of this? But then what we discovered was that the rest of the group just kind of rallied round them. One of them had to go out, and somebody else went out and comforted him until he was ready to come back in. Somebody else put their arms around the second one. And it was a wonderful thing to see how this moment that could have been really kind of shattering and disruptive for the group ended up being something that unified them and brought them together and made them closer. Because I think one of the strengths of the group is that people come from all over the world. They come from many different cultures. And you might think when somebody comes to this country that the first people that they would seek out would be their compatriots, people from the same country. But actually, the reality is, if you're from Iran, for instance, other Iranians may well be government spies or worse. If you're from another country, the other people from that country may well be the tribe that killed your father, or the political party that forced you to flee. And so actually the people you're least likely to want to hang out with are the people from your own country and culture. But the people in the group are from all over the place, and you don't have any common history with them except your psychological and emotional history. They have had the same psychological experiences as you. You don't need to explain yourself to them. You can cry and they will understand and they will comfort you. And that, I think, again, is a very powerful bond between the people in the group, and one of the reasons that they keep coming back.
As you said, there's like a beauty and a shared kind of knowledge, I guess. And, I think someone I spoke to a while ago said, I will never understand the refugee experience. I will understand the migrant experience myself, but not the refugee experience because I haven't lived in their shoes as much as I try to.
Yeah.
So it's, once you've been in those shoes and exactly, even though you might have different experiences of, coming over to the UK or different, in this instant would be different victims of or survivors of torture, I should say more. So it is that shared knowledge. And I saw a film yesterday, and it was I don't know if you've seen The Long Walk, but it's all about people with trauma, people going on this walk, and it was just showing.
No, I haven't watched it, but I do want to. Yeah.
But I think what came out of it, I was talking with two of my friends that we saw it together. It was that the only way you get through such horrors is through your mindset. And I think, like you said, being able to produce something that is ultimately beautiful, because art is beautiful no matter whether it's dark and twisted or truthful or whatever it might be. There's beauty in a poem or whatever it is. And shared experiences helps you, I don't want to say strong or makes you stronger, but I think helps you understand it, helps you be able to build past it, I think. And that's the beautiful aspect I think art has over any other kind of form of
I think that's true. I mean, we all know absolutely heartbreaking songs which are incredibly powerful, and the work of Goya, who did those amazing pen and ink sketches of war, and more recently a man called Otto Dix who did the same thing in the First World War in the trenches. I mean, they're images of unutterable suffering. I mean, absolutely grotesque, appalling things happening, but they're also beautiful. And that's something that the human experience, as you said, can uniquely express, is simultaneously a sort of beautiful expression of something profoundly awful.
Exactly. And I think it's also, like you said, when it comes from war, it is sometimes the most beautiful forms of art come in the most deepest, darkest times of someone's life. And so, I think it's incredible that Freedom from Torture is doing this writing group, because I think it just allows you to also feel more welcome, I feel also. So just moving on to the next part. So do you see yourself more as an artist who cares about human rights, or as a human rights advocate who uses art as a medium, especially from your work with Freedom from Torture as well?
Oh gosh, I did think about this. I don't think of myself as either of those things, actually. I mean, that seems like a tremendously pretentious thing to call oneself. I think I'm a storyteller who was brought up by a Quaker mother who believed in leaving the world better than she found it, and telling the truth, the pleasure of telling the truth, even when it was unpleasant to other people, and a Jewish father who could talk to anybody and enjoyed words and jokes. So my mother was a tremendous do-gooder. But and she had absolutely no scruples at all about shaking tins in people's faces and saying, if you can afford to smoke, you can afford to give me money. She was quite embarrassing. But she did have a very strong moral compass, and she did believe that you should try and leave the world better than you found it. But my father had a different way. I mean, he was much more inclined to help people that he knew. He was extremely generous. But he also had this generous spirit. So he would just as happily talk to the woman who came to clean our house over a cup of tea for hours as he would talk to a person with lots of letters after their names, or the president of the Royal Society. My mother was very annoying to me, actually, because I'm much more like my father. And so from a very early age, I started sort of collecting stories, and as you do, kind of crafting them to make them more interesting and kind of give them a shape and make people laugh and make them compelling. And my mother had this absolute genius for ruining it. So I would be sort of ramping up the hill to the punchline of my story, and my mother would say, no, it wasn't a Wednesday, it was a Tuesday. And the whole thing would be gone, and I would be completely furious with her. And it's funny now, because I have a daughter who's very unlike myself. And only through having a daughter who's unlike myself have I been able to understand how difficult it was for my mother having a daughter who was so unlike herself, because she tried incredibly hard to appreciate me for who I was and to share my values and to, be proud of me in the way that, for the things that I wanted her to be proud of. But actually, it was very difficult for her because she was a very different person. But anyway, I think that there's always a tension, because part of me just wants to kind of have fun and, play and be an artist and enjoy myself and go out with my friends and drink too much, And then the other part of me thinks, yes, but what should you be doing? And the thing about being brought up Quaker, which is a kind of burden I don't think you can ever shake off, is that every single decision in your life is either the right or the wrong thing to do. Which kind of cheese to buy? Should you buy cheese at all? How to travel? What to wear? What to spend your time on? Where to go in the evening? Where to buy your mugs. It's literally, you find yourself interrogating the kind of moral value of every decision that you make. And it is quite a burden sometimes. And sometimes I just wish I could forget it all and just kind of like do what I want to do. And that, of course, is what you have to do as an artist, as a person trying to create. You have to ignore the shoulds and actually just do what you feel like doing. So there is a sort of constant tension in me between those two impulses, but that I think can be quite creative too.
And just about your dad as well, did he ever share in depth about his refugee experiences with you?
He was one of those people who go through life refusing to look in the rearview mirror and absolutely uninterested in the chaos he leaves behind him. So he was very, very damaged in ways he didn't recognize and refused to acknowledge. And it played out in ways that were extremely damaging to us. But he would always say, if you asked him, I was really well treated and I was really lucky because I came to England and I survived and I was sent to this good school and I did well and I got a scholarship to Cambridge. But the reality is he was sent on his own at the age of 12 to a country where he knew nobody. He was absolutely hopeless in any kind of form of athletic activity. And he was sent to Gordonston because it was a school that had been founded by his mother's first cousin, which, as we know from the experiences of Prince Charles and Prince Philip, Gordonston is a school that specialises in turning out extremely athletic idiots. And he fitted in absolutely not at all. And he was very like his uncle Kurt Hahn in ways that the uncle really didn't want to be reminded of. And so it was just a really difficult experience for him. And then in addition to that was in 1938. And in November of 1938, Kristallnacht happened and his parents very nearly got taken away. They were luckily that they were tipped off by one of my grandfather's former students. And my father, as he said to me rather sardonically one day, I wasn't stupid, I knew what was going on, realised that the only way he could get his parents out, the only way he would see them alive again, was if he got them out himself. So it happened that Christmas, the first Christmas, he was sent to stay with a friend of Kurt Hahn, a rather nice woman who obviously had a bit of money, and had asked if there was a boy who needed somewhere to stay for Christmas. And my father looked around him and saw that it was a nice, comfortable place. And so after a week or so, he looked up from his supper one day and said, I'm having such a nice time here. I'm sure my parents would like it too. Do you think you might invite them over for a holiday? And of course, he knew what he was saying, and she knew what he was saying, that he basically needed her to sponsor them, which was not a small undertaking in those days. And she did. But they didn't actually manage to get out till April of 1939, so pretty much at the last minute. And so what I didn't know until I was commissioned to do a project about sort of related to this years later, was that all over England, all over Britain probably, but certainly all over England, there were small children doing exactly this. Children of 10, 11, 12, little children who knew that they would never see their parents again unless they got them out, who would go around the villages that they had been billeted, or the towns, up and down the streets, knocking on the doors of strangers, saying, will you give my mother a job? My dad can drive a car. My mother can clean. Please, please. Just desperate, because they were it was all on them. And I cannot imagine what that responsibility must have felt like. So although he always claimed that everything was fine and everything had been fine, and the other small detail was that his older brother killed himself, or at least died in mysterious circumstances when my father was 7. So he had a very bad time, but because he would never admit it or acknowledge it, it was also impossible to engage with him on the subject of the consequences of that and how it affected the rest of us. And so it was difficult, right until he died, it was difficult.
I think it's interesting to see that, children always know what's happening, even though they might seem like they don't. I don't know if you saw Waging Peace made a book out of children's drawings, and it was from the war in Sudan.
Oh,
yes. You could see in the
awful.
images
Just
exactly
awful.
what. So again, like you said, it's children always know. And having that again in the medium form of art in this instance to show and that these images are going to be used in international courts, war courts as well,
Oh
as
God,
it's
yeah, well,
crimes
one
against
hopes.
humanity.
Yeah,
So I think, there's an instance of art actually being able to be a form of trialing individuals
yeah.
as well. I mean, in the Holocaust, even people documented things through
Oh,
drawings as
sure.
well, and
Absolutely.
because they had no
Yeah,
cameras. Although I think
yeah.
there was one instance where they managed to sneak a camera in. So I think, it's quite interesting to see. I think a lot of refugee or children end up working in, human rights
Mm.
areas because I don't know whether it's through unconscious something unconscious that drives you into having a deeper understanding or seeing how there is that trauma still within the individual, and it could also be passed down. I think there's some trauma is passed down through genetics as well.
Generational trauma. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things there. I think for some people, they just don't want anybody else to have to go through what they went through. And so it's fair enough that that's what they should dedicate their lives to. I think in my personal case, again, a sort of indirect way in which it's affected me is that business of, because my father was a mathematician, and mathematics is an international language, and it is no respecter of anything other than native talent. You can't buy your way into being a mathematician. You can't be born into the right family in order to become a mathematician. Either you can do it or you can't. And people from anywhere can be mathematicians, and people from anywhere in the world can talk to each other in the language of maths. So my father found this extraordinary sort of global community of squiggles on paper, which he was able to make his new family. And so even from a very early age, there were these kind of weirdos from all around the world who would come and sit in our living room and, begrudgingly cooked supper by my mother. And many of them were very peculiar indeed. But we just got used to the idea that there were people from all over the world who were kind of sometimes quite interesting, but that everybody essentially was human and that everybody had that in common. And it made it much more interesting. I think if I'd been brought up in a family where all our friends were extremely respectable, sort of God-fearing, church-loving, tweed-wearing Christians, it would have been very dull by comparison.
Definitely. And from your work with Freedom from Torture, but also what you mentioned just now, what would you think are some of the challenges of using creative forms like film or writing to tackle heavy and often painful issues as well?
I think we've sort of talked about that. I think it's about, making it fresh, making it new, surprising people, getting behind their defences. And as I said, also, if you can, using an unexpected, an unlikely form for a story, an unlikely context, or making something funny when people expect it not to be. Just generally kind of tricking people into paying attention, probably, is what I would say.
And from that, as you mentioned, tricking people into things, when you tell obviously stories of that have such trauma and depth behind them, how or do you often make them hopeful? Do you think that's a useful tool to then obviously not live in a world that's all dark and painful, but see the other
Yeah,
half of it?
no, I think it's incredibly important, and actually, because our workshops happen on a Wednesday evening, and they finish at about 8 o'clock in the evening, and that's summer and winter. So a lot of people live on their own, and they have quite long journeys, and so you do not want to be sending people out into the miserly, sleety dark of a December or January night to go home on their own to an empty house with bad stuff in their heads. So we're very careful when we design our workshops and our conversations and our subjects. We're very careful never to invite people into the dark places. We have to design them in such a way that people who want to write about sad stuff can do so, because you obviously don't want to censor people either. You don't want to make them feel that anything that they want to write about is not legitimate or is not worthy. But we try to encourage people to take a positive and a creative, to look forwards rather than back, I suppose I would say. And so we design the workshops in such a way that there's a sort of certain amount of latitude in how you respond to them, precisely so that people will go away feeling hopeful and cheerful, with a bit of food inside them and the memory of some laughs that they've had and the companionship of the people. And they can bring people up, when they can bring each other up when they get home. They make friends with each other. They're quite a tight-knit group. So I think that is really, really important, is not to invite people to dwell on bad stuff, because you go down that road, you've only got to come back again.
Like you said, it's very like I was just going to say, probably the tight bonds are probably formed in those
Yeah,
perspectives as
absolutely.
well. So I guess
Yeah,
it's having a space, a safe space to share, and then you do feel lighter.
yeah,
Sometimes sharing is a lot
yeah.
better than
I think
keeping
so.
really
I mean,
busy.
I think absolutely sharing is really important. And as I said, I think it's very important not to censor people or make them feel that what they want to say isn't legitimate. And it can be very cathartic as well. Well, cathartic is a very bad word, but if you've got terrible things running around in your head that won't let you sleep at night or wake you up or give you nightmares or whatever, if you've got a pen and paper by the bed and you can just lean up on one elbow and write them down, then you've taken them out of your head and you've put them down on the page and you're in control of them and they'll stay there for you till you're ready to deal with them. It's like you're running them, they're not running you. So I think just always having a means of writing and something to write with and on with you wherever you go, day and night, is something I always tell the people in the group is really important. You become your own audience, and you also take control of your thoughts and your feelings and your experiences.
And from just looking back on your career as a whole, what's one project, or if you can't pick, maybe two, that you feel especially close to your heart, and why?
I think I'm very proud of The Electronic Frontier, which is this film I made in 1992 for the BBC, because I'd gone on this Fulbright to California in 1990, just at the beginning of digital, the first digital online communities, the first search engines, the first digital graphics, the first, all of those things were brand new and sort of extraordinary. And then somebody showed me the World Wide Web, which at that point was only in universities. And I just realized that everything was going to change. So I went to the BBC and I got them to give me some money. And we made this film called The Electronic Frontier. And the question at the start of the film was, what would the world look like with information as money? And who would be running it? And we thought Bill Gates, which isn't that far wrong because he was for quite a long time the richest man in America, in the world. And we had in it the computer in your pocket, which was 13 years before the iPhone. We had ubiquitous surveillance through smart devices. We had the death of copyright and IP. We had the death of Main Street. We had email, which was only inside Microsoft at that point. And we had deep fakes. We actually had the political risks from faking things. We got basically the first agency that was making digital graphics, and we got them to change a piece of footage of Bill Clinton's inauguration so that his hand was shaking. So all of those things were in that film I made 32 years ago, and here we are.
Most of it, all of it coming true, basically.
To do much about it. Yeah, I know, in the worst possible way. Well, good ways in some respects.
Well, that's the thing.
So yeah. I'm pretty proud of that. And then the other thing I think, which is completely different, is I wrote these 3 comic novels, and they were very silly, but I had enormous fun writing them. And actually, I think they've held up pretty well as well, even though they were written, 20 years ago. So I think 2 completely contrasting projects, one of them quite sort of complicated and technical, and one of them completely silly, but enormously good fun. I think those are the things that I would look back on and be most proud of.
And because you obviously do work and volunteer at Freedom from Torture as well in the writers group, so you do take some form of activism, whether it's indirect. But what does activism personally mean to you, and has it changed over the years?
I think what I try to do is I try to do things locally that I think will make a difference I can see. So I bake cakes for the Dr. Bike's bike mending workshop. I water the cottage garden that we planted on platform 1 of Kentish Town Station. I do bits and pieces of that kind of thing with groups locally. And then, on a bigger stage, I suppose I try and lend weight to things that I might or might not be able to influence directly, but might be able to influence indirectly. So giving money, going on marches, signing petitions, that kind of thing. I would really love to have got arrested on more than one occasion, but I can't afford to get arrested because I have to go to America to film from time to time. But once I've given up doing that, I shall definitely be one of those grannies in the street with a placard getting hauled off to be interrogated. So yeah, I think that's what I do.
And how do you sustain hope? I know we touched on it briefly, but how do you personally do it with creativity whilst working with obviously such heartbreaking themes and topics sometimes as well?
Domestic routine. my family, whom I love and who are very funny, music, obviously, nature. I have this office on a boat on the River Lee, between Clapton Common and Walthamstow in London, which is just beautiful, and you can't hear any traffic, and the swans had 8 babies this year, and it's just lovely. So I take myself off there and work, and it's a fantastic community as well of people living on these boats doing wonderful things. And of course, parrot and cat videos, which everybody needs for their sustenance.
Definitely, always. And because this is obviously part of my 16 Days of Activism series, if you could send one message to women and girls listening, maybe who have either, a part of your writing group, or girls that are interested in being part of the film industry or creative in that sense, what message would you send them?
Well, I have 2. One of them is from Dolly Parton, which is figure out who you are and do it on purpose, which I think is great, actually. And I think it's about, owning yourself and liking yourself, and, not obviously the bad bits of yourself. And the other one is just, think what you want to look back on your deathbed. Do you want your last thought to be, well, I never got what I dreamed of, and I never did that thing I really wanted to do, but at least I didn't make a fool of myself. And I think that particularly for women, it's so, I think with your generation, thank God it's changing a bit, but I think there's such a sort of sense of embarrassment about seeming to be kind of stuck up or conceited or unaware of your own deficiencies, being that person who's just like goes around thinking they're great and is actually just ridiculous. And I think that can really often women actually think it's better to not try than to seem like a, oaf. And I just think that's really pernicious, and it's really dangerous. And I think you should really try the thing you want to do, because what's the worst going to happen? What is the worst that can happen? You try and you fail, and you get up and you try again.
It's funny you say that, because that is the motto that I live by, is I don't want to be on my deathbed and think, you will never regret trying things. You will only regret not trying them. So knowing that you wanted to do something, but you didn't, but if you did try it, maybe it wasn't for you, or maybe, it wasn't meant to be in that way because you didn't like it, but you found something else. But that is such an incredible message to have, whether it's through the work that you want to do, or you fighting for someone's rights, or for your own experience. I think that's such an important message to be able to hold on, and the drive, I guess, as well.
Yeah, I mean, if a door opens, you go through it.
Exactly, and not stare for it. And who are some women that have inspired your journey in creativity, or personally as well?
I'm really bad at heroes and heroines. I sort of discovered this when I was living in America, and somebody said, "Who are your heroes?" And I thought, "Oh shit, oh bother. I don't know who. I'd never." Anyway, but since then, I suppose my great grandmother Fanny Mendelssohn, because she was this incredible, funny, brilliant, creative genius who didn't get any encouragement but went on anyway. Clara Schumann, another woman of the same generation, same kind of difficulties, not the same discouragement, but the same obstacles in other respects, who had 8 children and supported the 8 children and her husband by touring the world as a pianist in the middle of the 19th century. It was just extraordinary. And actually another pianist, I'm giving you musicians because they're the people I sort of have been thinking about most recently. There was an extraordinary woman called Mara Hess, about whom my friend Jessica has just written a great biography, who at the beginning of World War II realized that she was a concert pianist, and she realized that people were going to need music to see them through. And so she went to the National Gallery in London and she said, "Can I put on concerts here? I'd like to just put on some concerts here." And they said, "Well, I guess so, probably." And she then put on a concert every day throughout the war in the National Gallery. And she kept going with bombs, with whatever it was. She just kept on putting, because she knew that music was this thing that would pull people through, and that would save them, no matter what cost and danger to herself. I suppose as a writer, somebody like George Eliot, brilliant depictor of everything there is to know about human society with a sense of humour. And as a filmmaker, I think a contemporary filmmaker, there's a woman called Clio Barnard who makes, I think, absolutely wonderful films. And so I'm a big fan of hers.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing everything with me, from film to activism to your family history as well. It's been really incredible to listen to everything, because as a lot of artists have, it's your own experiences or the things you grew up around that really shape the stories that you want to tell also, and what you end up doing. So it's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, it's always very enjoyable talking about oneself. So thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been very interesting talking to you and hearing your perspective on things as well. So a great privilege. Thank you.